Today's critique examines a submission that draws parallels between the 1970s dystopian novel The Camp of the Saints, a recent attempted bombing in New York City, and the subsequent media coverage.
Yeah, and while the material makes a really strong case right off the bat by highlighting all that vivid contemporary footage, we should immediately look at how to strengthen it.
Anchoring the contemporary examples explicitly to the core literary thesis throughout the entire piece will create a much stronger, unified narrative. As I understand it from the notes, the argument here is that the novel explains real-world events. But I like to think of the current structure like a bridge missing its central pillars.
Right, like it starts super strong on one side with that literary reference, but then the other side, the latter half of the text, is just completely disconnected from that foundation.
Exactly. Because the weakness here is that the piece opens strongly with a dystopian novel framing, but then just totally abandons this anchor halfway through.
Yeah, I mean, when detailing the media coverage, the Toronto incident, and the Minneapolis anecdotes, the narrative loses its initial literary lens.
Which basically leaves the second half feeling like a disconnected list of grievances rather than a cohesive thesis.
Right. So the suggestion is to weave the specific motifs or character archetypes from the novel back into the later examples to act as a recurring thematic spine. Is there a risk that focusing solely on those modern examples might overlook the intellectual weight of the opening?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, dropping the book reference really weakens the ending. So to fix that, we need concrete examples.
Well, for instance, when discussing Mitchell Erickson in Minneapolis regretting his call to the police, you could explicitly compare him back to the French hippie from the novel's opening who welcomed the invaders.
Oh, that's a great connection.
Yeah, and another, when analyzing the media's framing of the bombing, refer back directly to the concept of Big Other versus Big Brother that was introduced in the first paragraph.
Yeah, exactly. So once the narrative structure is unified with those literary pillars, the next step is ensuring the arguments held within that structure are unbreakable. Addressing the strongest potential counterarguments head-on will significantly elevate the persuasive power of the core thesis. Let's look closely at the section discussing the reaction of Walter Masterson to the bombing.
Right. The footage there is definitely compelling, but there is a missing element in the dialectic process.
Yeah, because the real weakness is that the text relies way too heavily on mocking the most extreme or absurd reactions, like Walter Masterson laughing at the bomb, or that woke hyperbole.
I mean, yeah, it's shocking, but it leaves the argument vulnerable to accusations of cherry pick, you know? It makes it look like you're only engaging with the absolute weakest opposition.
Right, so the suggestion is to introduce and systematically dismantle the mainstream, moderate counterarguments regarding immigration and vetting, rather than exclusively focusing on the fringes.
Building on that point, what if we looked at it from the perspective of standard policy defenders?
Yeah, we definitely need to Steelman the opposition. As a concrete example, instead of solely asking rhetorical questions like, why is there a single Afghan in this country? Actively state the common establishment argument.
Like humanitarian asylum or economic necessity.
Exactly. And then use the provided data, like the bomber's parents owning a $2.25 million home, to totally subvert those specific policy defenses.
Yeah, and you should also address the counter-argument that the attackers are just isolated lone wolf by expanding on the broader radicalization network mentioned briefly in the sleeper cell segment.
Okay, so we've bulletproofed the argument. And once the structure is sound and the counter-arguments are defeated, the final layer is polishing the delivery so the audience cannot easily dismiss the message, allowing the extraordinary documented events to speak for themselves without relying on broad generalizations will make the core message far more impactful to a wider audience. I can see what you're going for here. Let's see how we can strengthen this.
I mean, the author's frustration is palpable and totally justified by the evidence presented.
It is, but doesn't the current tone actually give the subjects of the critique an easy out to ignore the facts?
That makes sense. But could the evidence also support a different conclusion, like leaning into the emotional outrage to rally the base?
I don't think so. The weakness is that the frequent use of absolute statements and polarizing labels, like claiming every leftist in the country wants the destruction of Western civilization, or using terms like incel, it really diminishes the credibility of the very real, objectively shocking video footage and media headlines presented.
Right. It just alienates readers who might otherwise be convinced by the data.
Exactly. So the suggestion is to rely on precision and restraint in the commentary. Frame these incidents as undeniable, alarming data points rather than relying on hyperbole.
Basically, let the contrast between the events and the media's reaction do the heavy lifting.
Yeah, so practically remove sweeping declarations like every leftist in the country. Instead, let the detailed side-by-side breakdown of the misleading AP and NBC headlines stand as self-evident proof of the media's ideological bias.
All right, and when describing the Toronto incident, avoid editorializing the attacker's mental state and background if it's not strictly necessary. Simply highlight the stark contrast between the violent reality on the street and the authorities' catch-and-release policy.
Exactly. So to quickly recap our three main takeaways, weave the literary anchor of the Camp of the Saints throughout the entire piece to unify the structure, address the strongest counterarguments to bulletproof the thesis, and utilize rhetorical restraint to let the shocking factual evidence speak for itself.
Yeah, and just to summarize the actionable next steps, revise the second half to include those book motifs, add a Steelman counterargument paragraph, and edit out those hyperbolic absolutes. Please implement these changes and submit the revised material back in for another critique.